Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and this is all very interesting because it just came to my mind that perhaps sometimes people get into conflict because some of them are more oriented toward evolutionary explanations and others are more oriented toward more social, cultural aspects, let's say. But perhaps there's a way of joining those two approaches together, because I mean, I don't know if you agree with the approach that many evolutionary psychologists nowadays have, that is the massive modularity of the human mind, that basically is that perhaps our mind is composed of several different modules, cognitive modules, that we evolved each of them to deal with a specific type of evolutionarily relevant problem. An example would be reproduction, another survival, and all of those things. But perhaps there's two things going around here at the same time. On the one hand, perhaps it is true that we have an innate basis for what we consider beautiful, and we've already talked a little bit here about what we consider beautiful in terms of people's aspects, and what we consider beautiful in terms of our natural environments and the environments that surround us. But on the other hand, it is also part of our evolved repertoire to pay attention to what goes around in our social environment, because, I mean, again, as I've already alluded to, we really have to establish cooperative relationships at least with the people that are part of our in-group. Otherwise, it would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for us to survive in our own. So I guess that perhaps there's a way to explain why, for example, sometimes, particularly with the advent of the modernist movement in the arts and then also the postmodernist one, that people value things that before perhaps we would consider ugly. But then again, perhaps in those cases, the modules that are related to our social lives and how we move in our social environments get more activated to explain how things that come from modernism and postmodernism might have become popular. Because, I mean, if people that are high status love them, and perhaps they love them because it is very easy for them to distinguish themselves from other people, because those things are not really likable, let's say, to the vast majority of people. But then with time they set a standard, and then if you want to be considered of a good social position, or if you want for other people to look at you as having a good position in the social hierarchy, perhaps you really have to learn to have a positive experience when being in touch with those kinds of art. Again, I don't know if I'm saying something that makes sense here or not. But.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. You bring up several different issues here. One of them is the relation between social and evolutionary, or social and biological, or and yes, you're absolutely right. There are people who are simply much more interested, and this is fine, this is not a criticism, there's some people simply much more interested in, say, historical specificity or cultural distinctiveness, and some people who are much more interested in cross-cultural patterns. I happen to be somebody who's much more interested in cross-cultural patterns, but I don't think these are mutually exclusive, and I think that was part of your point, was that they shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive. For some reason, to a great extent in literary study, at least this is changing somewhat. I think it's less true now than it was 15 years ago, say. But when I was a graduate student or had just gotten my PhD and was a young assistant professor, there was a widespread view that if you, I mean, a bizarre, truly bizarre view that if you were interested in what human beings had in common, you were some sort of reactionary fascist monster. And it's just, and of course, when you talk about this, you have to say, oh, well, you know, sure, universalism has been put to bad uses and we have to struggle against those. And we have to be on the side of all those differentialists. Well, it's just nonsense. I mean, yeah, if you make false universal statements, then you can get things mucked up. Yeah, that's true. Anytime you make false statements, you can get things mucked up. But if you look historically, overwhelmingly, the oppression of one group by another has been rationalized by reference to difference, not by reference to universality. So it was just a perverted idea, but in any case, it was widespread. And this meant that historical and cultural specificity, or as it was phrased then, difference, was what was valued. But my contention all along has been that you have to recognize both. There's, of course, variability across cultures and historical periods, and there are also commonalities. As many cognitivists have pointed out, even to compare two items, they need to have something in common. So in order to compare different traditions of art, they have to have something in common that you're calling them art. Dennis Dutton said that, for example. Now, in fact, I tend to see differences as much more superficial than most of my colleagues would see them. And I would also generally not phrase it as a matter of differences. I usually phrase it as a matter of specification of universal principles. I mean, they are different specifications, but, and here again, my model is linguistic in that you can have widespread syntactic, morphological, or other principles that are shared across a wide range of languages, but specific lexical items may differ. Now, specific lexical items are what we see most obviously. So how in Mandarin means good, it doesn't mean what how means in English, right? So everybody, you know, one's inclination is to say, wow, those are different. But you can say good in English, it just doesn't use the same sound. You know, I mean, to use a very simplistic example, just to illustrate. Moreover, in order to understand either cultural differences or cultural universals, cross-cultural universals, you need to combine both those forms of study. And again, I'll take a really simplistic case. It's many writers, Abhigyan Shakuntalam, the recognition of Shakuntala, is generally considered the sort of masterpiece of Sanskrit drama. And a number of writers chastised or criticized Sanskrit dramatists, including Kalidasa, the author of Abhigyan Shakuntalam, for just being disorganized and meandering all over and bringing in all sorts of irrelevant stuff and not being streamlined and so on. And basically they were able to do that because they didn't recognize that Abhigyan Shakuntalam is doing a wide range of things that are done maybe in slightly different ways, but are done in Western literature also. So one example is it establishes, it enhances what I call enhances unobtrusive symmetry by setting up, by pairing acts. So the first act and the final act are parallel. The second act and the penultimate act are parallel, and so on. It's very mathematically structured. Another instance that requires a knowledge of cultural distinction is foreshadowing. Kalidasa uses foreshadowing in Abhigyan Shakuntalam, just like any number of Western works use foreshadowing. I don't know if this is true in Portugal, but in the United States, at least when I was growing up, grade school and high school, one of the main things you talked about in looking at literature was, see how this foreshadows what's going to happen later on. So we're very, it's this very, very big topic in younger days of literary study. So, but you won't know that so, for example, after the two main lovers meet in the beginning of Shakuntalam, Dushyanta and Shakuntala, they're the main couple, not the main, they're the couple that the story is about. After they meet, we hear the cry of a Chakravaka bird. Now, this just seems to somebody like Hegel, for example, writing on Sanskrit drama and the history of art, writing on it as something excessive and incoherent and monstrous. This just seems something irrelevant. But in fact, there's a myth connected with the Chakravaka bird to which the call of the Chakravaka bird alludes. And that's the myth of male and female Chakravaka bird mating and then being separated in the course of the night, but then being reunited in the morning. This is a commonplace story that everybody watching the play would have known about. So as soon as you have that, the cry of a Chakravaka bird, you expect that the lovers are going to be separated, but then eventually reunited. So that's a case where you have to have specific cultural knowledge in order to make any sense out of what is in fact a cross-cultural pattern. The second thing you brought up in your question was the massive modularity hypothesis. And as you've probably gathered from my previous answers, well, two things. The first thing I should say is that I wouldn't agree with somebody who objects to that in principle. Sure, that's people like John Tooby and LIETZCKE examining, researching in that tradition. They're doing valuable work, and it's a research program that should be followed through in competition with other research programs. So I'm not at all dismissing it, but as you probably gathered from my previous answers, I'm more inclined to find, I feel it is simpler in the Occam's razor sense. It's simpler and thus theoretically preferable to have more general principles that apply more broadly. And that's why, for example, I don't have anything like an aesthetics module. I have the idea that there are various processes that have a range of applications and when combined give you aesthetics or aesthetic response.
Perhaps it had something to do with the social aspect, because toward the end of my question, I referred to the fact that perhaps there are times where we value something because the modules that are related to or operate under social context or social conditions or that deal with information that come from the social environment get more activated than other modules.
Yeah, sure. You're absolutely right. Social interaction, again, I wouldn't phrase it in terms of modules, although I certainly would admit that the cognitive and affective principles that bear on our interactions with human beings are more closely integrated with one another than they are with a range of other cognitive principles, so those relating to physics or something. So I'm certainly willing to distinguish a set of interrelated cognitive principles that relate to language, for example, or that relate to theory of mind, or that relate to folk physics. So certainly there are complexes like that. I'm not inclined to see them as modules, however, because modules are typically understood as self-enclosed and interacting only in outputs. And I tend to see the principles as more interacting at more levels than at the level of output. So, but that's maybe for the sorts of things we're discussing, maybe that isn't a crucial issue. But certainly there are social aspects to literature that I've talked about in some places, but I haven't emphasized either in the universals work or the aesthetics work. But for example, I think a central aspect of the value of literary or artistic study is in what Bernard Rimet refers to as partage in French, sharing. We have a desire to share things with other people. Part of our experience of being socially engaged with other people is sharing experiences with them. And aesthetic experiences, literary experiences, art experiences, music experiences, we like to go to a concert with somebody else and talk to the person about it afterwards, or walk through a gallery with somebody else. And that sort of social sharing is, I would see it as related to my analysis of aesthetic response, because aesthetic response is so bound up with attachment bonding. And this is, friendship is a form of attachment bonding. And so cultivating attachment or romance, I mean, you go on a date with somebody, or go with your partner to a gallery or to a concert or whatever. These all centrally involve attachment feelings. And so in my account, they're very closely related. But even if one didn't have that account, it's clear that part of our sociality, it does involve that sort of social sharing. And that's clearly an important aspect of literature and art.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. Okay, so what would you like for us to know more about human universals when it comes to fictional literature? Because, I mean, perhaps there are several categories of human universals in this case. Perhaps there are human universals in terms of emotions, in terms of types of characters, in terms of genres and things like that. So what would you say are perhaps the main things that we have to take into account here?
Well, there have been two real areas of sustained research in literary universals. One is the area that I've been working on, which is narrative structure, story structure, I should say, story structure, and recurring story structures. And as I mentioned before, that's easier to research on one's own because one can rely on translations, since story structure tends to be preserved pretty well across translations. The other area in which there's been a great deal of research is in particular formal aspects of poetry. So lineation, the structure of lineation, the length of lines, the use of such formal aesthetic features as alliteration, assonance, rhyme, meter, organization of syllables in recurring ways distinct from syntactic structure, thus in lineation. All of these things related to particular features of poetic structure, particular formal features of poetry, have been pretty well researched. Writers ranging from Jeffrey Russum and Nigel Fabb, who are both involved with the Literary Universals Project, Paul Kaparsky, to Morris Holly and others. So that's another, I said two areas, there are actually three areas, I almost forgot one. So those are two areas that have been well researched in universals. A third area that hasn't received, seems to me, as extensive treatment, but has received good treatment, is the use of metaphors, cross-cultural use of metaphors. Just the reason I sort of briefly forgot about that is it's a sort of really, it's presented, and this is perfectly reasonable, as a subset of research on metaphor rather than a subset of research on universals. So it's sort of categorized in my mind differently. But that's another area where there's been pretty good work. And all of those areas still require more work. There's more research to be done on things such as character typology, which is related to story structure, but not identical with story structure. And formal features of, these different writers on formal features of poetic structure have different accounts of how that operates and what the exact formal features are and so on. So there's plenty of room in both of those areas for further research. But really everything else in literature has hardly been studied at all. So I have a little bit on image patterns, but I'm very constrained because I had to rely either on works where I could check the original to see if the image was there, or where the translator actually gave me a footnote saying, in the original, this is an image of such and such. So, so that was very constraining. So image patterns, for example, the whole area of what's called discourse is almost unresearched in a cross-cultural area. So such things as varieties of narration, narrator knowledge, narrator attitude, narrational structure. I mean, it's clear to me that a number of traditions, I haven't worked on this formally, but just informally from reading in a number of different traditions, it's obvious that a number of different traditions have developed cliffhanger endings for episodes. So, I mean, you get in it's a kind of cliche of Chinese prose fiction that you'll get to an end of the chapter and you know they'll actually end with like a question. It'll be something like, and what will happen? Will Wang fall off the cliff? Will he be rescued? To find out, read the next chapter. So or whatever. So it's formally marked in much Chinese prose fiction. But though I've observed this informally, it's not something that I've researched. But all of those techniques of such thing, what's called implotment, the order of story elements, whether they're chronological or not chronological. If they're not chronological, whether there's a preference for flashbacks or flash forwards, how you mark flash forwards or flashbacks, whether there's repetition of incidents, whether incidents are told differently from different points of view with different narrational foci. All of these sorts of questions that are important in narratology within generally focused on the Western tradition or modern non-Western traditions, which don't really count for universal study because in the modern period, everybody's reading everyone else, so you don't get areal distinctness. You get everybody's influencing everyone else, so it doesn't show anything that's relevant to universalist study. But these are areas that are very important to narratological study, but have hardly been touched on in the study of universals. So if anybody watching this interview, for example, this discussion, has things that they, in any of these areas, the areas that have been researched, such as story structure or poetic form, or areas that haven't, such as narrational or implotment features, character typology, and so on. If anyone watching this has any interest in that, I'd urge them to go to the Literary Universals Project, maybe query us if they were thinking of writing something. We're also having a little symposium in May. At the end of May, there's a call for papers on the Literary Universals Project website. Somebody might be interested in that. It's just a vast area that's hardly been, where research has hardly begun. It seems to me much less research than, say, cross-cultural patterns in music, which has a longer history.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting. And I think that another aspect that we can study in fictional literature in terms of human universals, and I'm going to ask you this because I've recently had on the show Dr. Michelle Scalise Sugiyama, and she does a lot of work on oral storytelling. So I would like to ask you about the role that fictional literature, and perhaps this goes back even before we've invented written language and literature in general, this goes back to oral storytelling. What is the role that it plays in human societies? Because I mean, when we ask people this, I guess that one of the big answers that people give is related to the fact that perhaps stories or fictional literature, the role that it plays in human societies is to convey moral messages. But perhaps that's one side of it, but it probably has many other factors that go into it, right?
Sure. But first of all, before answering the question, Michelle has a couple of essays on the Literary Universals project, and well, I mean, as far as I know, is actually going to be speaking at the conference in Connecticut in May. I mean, I anticipate that she'll be speaking there. So, great person to interview. She does very good work.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the purpose of literature. Well, certainly literature does typically operate in such a way as to, you might call it convey moral messages. It typically does have some sort of moral or political function. However, I don't think that's that initiates the development or production of literature. I think literature principally is produced because of our engagement with stories. It's pleasurable to experience stories, and it's pleasurable for adaptive reasons. And I don't mean the adaptive reasons that are usually given. What I mean is, this goes to another work of mine, How Authors' Minds Make Stories, which is a book on literature and simulation, and what the evolutionary function of simulation is. So I there discuss literature as a specific form of simulation, or imagination is a more common way of phrasing it, a less technical way. What's usually referred to in ordinary languages, imagination, is referred to as simulation in cognitive science generally. It's what's sometimes called offline projection of sequences of particular sequences of causality, usually involving agents. So people doing stuff, either counterfactually or hypothetically. In other words, so we might simulate, well, what would hypothetically, what would happen if I went and talked to my department head about getting a course release or something? That'd be a simulation. So literature is one form of simulation, and simulation is a crucial evolutionary development. Why is it crucial? Well, it's crucial because of that offline part. It allows us to think through possible courses of action, or to learn from past mistakes. You know, I look back and say, oh, if only I had done this instead of that, then that would have all been different. And I learned that the next time I'm faced with a similar situation, I react in the alternative way that I simulated, not in the way that I did react. So it's evolutionarily very important that we're able to reduce the costs of simply learning from actually making mistakes by simulating behaviors that we can, so we can eliminate some, obviously not all, we can eliminate some mistakes through simulating, through imagining the negative outcomes that would eventuate if we pursued the line of action that we're imagining or that we're simulating. So what I talk about there in my account of simulation is that for simulation to work evolutionarily, it has to have several features. One feature is that it has to approximate the hedonic quality of the outcome. So in other words, if imagining something that has a positive outcome is supposed to encourage us to pursue that line of action, then imagining it should give us some pleasure. We should be attracted to it. Conversely, if imagining an outcome that would be a failure is going to dissuade us from the action, then it should have some sort of aversive. We should have some sort of aversive response to it. We should go, ooh, yeah, I don't want to do that, and thus avoid it. So it has to be motivational. That is not surprising given the way simulation works. Simulation works by activating the same general areas, not in all details, of course, but broadly speaking, the same areas that would be activated if we were in fact engaging in or seeing or sensing the what we're imagining. So we don't have like one set of neurons that are all for imagination and another completely separate set that are for acting and perceiving and so on. They're significantly overlapping. They're not fully identical because we experience actually doing something as different from imagining doing it. But the neuron populations involved in the two processes are largely identical, though not completely. So it's not surprising that our emotional response in the two cases, either pleasurable or aversive, would be a version of what we would experience in the actual, if the events actually occurred. So that makes sense. There are two qualifications, however. The first qualification is that the pleasurable experience can't be so pleasurable that we have no motivation to actually do the thing. So it has to be a limited pleasure, because if imagining, getting a good job made me as happy as getting a good job, well, why fill out the application form and go through the interview and so on? I'm just as happy imagining the job. The other more difficult one is that the aversive response to failure or to negative outcomes has to be compensated for by some sort of enjoyment. Why do I say that? Well, because if it weren't compensated for in any way, if there weren't anything that drove us, that motivated us to imagine aversive outcomes, as soon as we had the inkling that something was going to be an aversive outcome, we would just stop thinking about it. And then it wouldn't motivate us to avoid it. So we have to be able to pursue trains of thought that will lead to aversive outcomes, even though the outcomes are unpleasant. I cite research that suggests that there's dopaminergic system activity in simulation generally. And if that's true, that's all that's needed. The dopaminergic activation, the reward system, or in Panksepp's terms, seeking system, encourages us to pursue lines of activity. It drives us to pursue lines of activity. So we have this complex simulatory processing, these complex simulatory processes that are highly adaptive and have complex implications regarding our emotional responses to imagined situations, and including a pleasurable component to even aversive situations. So how does this all relate to literature? Well, my contention is this is exactly what happens in literature. In a brief response in a couple of years ago that was published, that I published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, I spell this out in more precisely than I do in how authors' minds, or more concisely, I should say, than I do in how authors' minds make stories. And what I argue there is that this solves what are called the paradox of fiction and the paradox of tragedy. The paradox of fiction is that we either enjoy or feel grief over fictional stuff. We know that Romeo and Juliet don't exist, and yet maybe we feel grief over their deaths. We know that Hamlet doesn't exist, but maybe we don't want him to commit suicide. But of course, there's no one there to commit suicide. So this is seen as paradoxical. But in fact, it isn't paradoxical because it's the way simulation operates. Simulation operates to have these emotional effects. The paradox of tragedy is that we experience pleasure in something that is apparently aversive, tragedy. And both of the examples I gave, Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, are tragic. So why would that be? Well, again, it's not a particular problem because, again, that's the way that simulation operates. So getting back to your question, so what I think is going on with the production of literature is that we have these simulative propensities and we are therefore driven to simulate regularly. We simulate all the time. We are even simulating an actual experience because we're filling in aspects of a current situation that we're not directly experiencing. So, somebody, if you're talking to a class or something and somebody has a funny face, you go, oh, I wonder if I said something wrong, because you're simulating what they're thinking. So simulation is going on all the time. literature is a systematic, finely honed form of simulation. I think that's what its primary function is. I don't think that that means it's like cheesecake in Steven Pinker's term. Cheesecake is something we have a taste for, but that's pretty much bad for you. I mean, there's really not much good that's done by eating cheesecake. I don't think that's at all the case with literature. One of the reasons is that literature does involve moral or political purposes, though I think that there are I don't think that those initiated, as I said before. I think they're initiated by the simulative processes. But part of our pleasure in experiencing any simulation is not only the immediate pleasure of, say, sensation or esteem from others or whatever we might simulate, but is also a modulated enjoyment when we judge our experience relative to our own moral principles. So that even in our ordinary simulation, if I imagine doing something that I might consider unethical, part of my aversive response to that will be my judgment that I would consider that unethical, and I would be doing it myself. So moral evaluation and political interests are part of our simulation and part of our emotional experience in simulation. So I think they first of all enter that way. They also enter, the moral message, as you said, enters that way. They also enter, however, more self-consciously through processes of social generation of literature. So that, and this is what makes literature a little more complicated, and where I might diverge from the, perhaps, I don't want to sound like I'm criticizing literature. Obviously, I teach literature. I think I love literature, but there may be a tendency among cognitivists who very kindly celebrate literature. There may be a tendency to underestimate its sometimes politically harmful effects. And one of the reasons it can have politically harmful effects, it convey sexist or racist or other sorts of ideology. One of the reasons it can do that is because of the social system in which it's produced. The social system is almost necessarily greatly, disproportionately influenced by people who are dominant in the society, and much less influenced by people who are dominated in the society. So there's, in Marxist terms, in Gramscian terms, there's going to be a tendency for literature to reflect hegemonic ideas, the ideas of dominant classes. And this is true whether you have a feudal system where artists are patronized, they're actually paid, kept by particular aristocrats, or capitalist economies in which the author has to get some sort of firm to publish his or her work and circulate it, and so on. So there are all these social factors that affect the political consequences of a work. The final thing I would mention is something that I tend to think of as somewhat incidental to the purposes of producing literature, but that is a very important consequence of producing literature, which is a number of writers, Kidd and Castano, Keith Oatley, of course, Keith Oatley's colleague at York, I'm forgetting his name, Marr, have done work indicating that study of literature can improve theory of mind skills. And this doesn't seem to me surprising. I mean, it's not fully established, but it seems to me something that one would have expected, that focused attention on complex aspects of theory of mind and focused attention on developing on the simulative enhancement of empathic response to groups of individuals that one ordinarily wouldn't even think about, those sorts of things would enhance theory of mind skills and empathic sensitivity. That's what one would expect. And so this is again why I don't think that literature is like cheesecake, because even if we're not consuming literature or producing literature principally for the theory of mind and empathic benefits, and of course some people are doing it for that reason, but many people aren't. Most people aren't, I think. Even if they aren't doing it for those benefits, it has those benefits. So to conclude by going back to Pinker, maybe, one other thing on that. That isn't to say it's unique in that. I'm guessing there are other ways in which people can enhance their, if you don't really like literature all that much, that doesn't mean you're necessarily an unempathic person. So presumably there are many other ways one can enhance empathic response or theory of mind skills, but literature does seem to be a valuable way of doing that. So maybe a better way of using the analogy, the sort of analogy that Steven Pinker wants to set up would be something like literature isn't like cheesecake, literature is maybe like fruit. We eat fruit. We may not eat fruit because we're going to get vitamin C or whatever. Maybe we eat fruit because it tastes good, but it does give us vitamin C. So it is beneficial for us, and fiber and all sorts of stuff. But that, of course, doesn't mean you can't get vitamin C or fiber or whatever from other sources, too. So you don't have to eat fruit, but it's a good thing. Eating fruit is good. And reading literature is good.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and perhaps about that last point, about the relationship between fictional literature and theory, and the development of theory of mind, or perhaps the expansion of some of our abilities regarding theory of mind, perhaps in societies that lack literature, like more traditional societies of hunter-gatherers or horticulturalists and other peoples like that, perhaps oral storytelling fulfills that role as well.
Absolutely. I completely agree. So when I say literature, I sort of tacitly mean literature and orature, rather than repeating it every time. Since you've brought that up, it might be worth noting that there's, I've forgotten his name. Let me see if I wrote it down. Let me see if I can. The guy who says that the piranha, Daniel Everett.
Dan Everett, yeah.
Yeah, who says that the piranha don't have storytelling. And I found an interview with him where the interviewer asks about the piranha, they do not have creation myths, but they do practice storytelling. And he says, no. They get together as they love gossip about how we are, about how are people doing, is anyone sick, or has anyone died. They share the news about what is going on. So in other words, they engage in storytelling. What are they doing if they're saying, this is what happened, this is how the person died, this is what the news is? Gossip is storytelling. I'm guessing what he means is that they don't have a canon of stories that gets repeated. And I don't know whether they do or not. I tend to be skeptical of these discoveries of huge differences. They seem to me to be like I guess it's Mark Twain joke. Maybe it's not Mark Twain. I want to attribute it to Mark Twain anyway. The news of my death has been greatly exaggerated. It seems to me that often happens with these stories of these huge differences. You either find that the properties that are supposedly so weird in the other society we have, or the properties that they supposedly don't have, they do have. Now, there may be in different proportions, but we generally find them. An example that I often use of this doesn't concern the piranha, but concerns the Aymara, who you may remember a number of years ago, there was this big thing that it was discovered that they think the future is behind. They model the future on behind and the past on in front. And, this is like totally bizarre. We would never do any such thing. We would never think of the future as behind. Old age is creeping up on me. It's not creeping up on me from in front. Or Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. What's hurrying near is the future, and it's hurrying at my back. So we actually do use this when the future is unknown. So in fact, what seemed to be this radical difference is a difference in proportion. Now that's interesting. It isn't to say that it's insignificant. It's worth knowing that there's a difference in proportion, or a difference in sort of default case. But it's not an absolute difference, and I suspect that we'll find out well, I mean, even from this quote from Everett, it seems clear that there isn't an absolute difference. They are engaging in storytelling of some sort if they're giving the news. So storytelling seems to be, as far as I can tell, an absolute universal despite such news reports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The case with Dan Everett and the PIRAA is very interesting, and I recently also interviewed Dr. Iris Berendt, that I don't know if you know about her, but she's a linguist, and we also refer to the particularities that Dan Everett reports about the PIRAA, and he also refers to the fact that they don't think about the future and that their language lacks recursion. That is one of the elements that Noam Chomsky included in his universal grammar. But I mean, I guess it's still very, very controversial. I mean, at least the findings as Everett reports them about the PIRAA. So, yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we have to finish because we've already done more than 90 minutes here.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, just before we go, I wanted to talk with you also about the relationship between literature and emotion, but perhaps we could leave that to another interview if you don't mind. So just one last question. Since you work in a humanities department and literature, I mean, when people think about literature, they associate it with the humanities and not really with scientific disciplines like psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, and all of those things that you apply in your work. Do you get a lot of backlash from some of your colleagues, particularly the ones that are perhaps more into postmodernism, and in particularly in regards to studying innate aspects of the human mind and human universals?
Well, my colleagues, if by my colleagues you mean people at the University of Connecticut, no. It's not like the perfect place to be, and no place is perfect. We have tensions and so on, but I've never encountered that as a problem at University of Connecticut. If you mean in the profession generally, well, that's certainly an issue. Again, it's less an issue than it was. Well, when I wrote, I've told you, you may have even heard this story because I've talked about it in other interviews or elsewhere. But when I wrote The Mind and Its Stories, I sent it to a number of different publishers. Oh, well, actually, even before that, when I wrote Politics of Interpretation, I had sent it to different publishers, and it was routinely rejected. The Mind and Its Stories, which has, once it got published, it was fairly well received, although maybe more well received among psychologists than among literary people, but still. But it took it was rejected by something like 20 publishers. And I remember once sending it to a publisher that I sent it on like a Monday, and it was back in my mailbox on Friday, and it was in the same box I sent it in. As far as I can tell, what the editor did is opened the box, saw the word universals in the title, closed the box, and sent it back, because it didn't even seem to have been removed from the box. So certainly it's been, people in literature have often not been very open to the idea of cognitive study of literature, literary universals, anything like that. And part of it was this bizarre political atmosphere. Or I think Gerald Graff was right when he said it's not really a political atmosphere, it's pseudo-politics. It isn't even really politics, it's like a pretense of being politics. So this sort of pseudo-politics of cultural, you're bad if you don't celebrate difference. But anyway, yeah, that has been a problem, but I think it's way less of a problem now. And I mean, when I started doing this cognitive approach to literature 30 years ago, there was hardly anyone else doing it. I mean, there was the Mark Turner and people around Mark, but Mark was that was almost it. I mean, that was very good. It was very valuable work. But it was more allied with cognitive linguistics and Lakoffian orientation than it was really with literary study. But then, of course, when I started writing on it, mine was perhaps more allied with cognitive science than with literature departments too. But again, this has changed massively. You have no idea. It was like, to mention the sort of work cognitivists are doing now, 25 years ago it was almost unspeakable, and now there's one of the main groupings. I mean, the Modern Language Association, the main association for humanists in the United States, or literary people in the United States, is the Modern Language Association, and it has subsections based on either literary period or theoretical approach. And there's a cognitive approach, cognitive and affect approaches forum. I don't know why they call them fora, but it's a forum. That's one of the main theoretical approaches now in the MLA. So due to the very good work of a wide range of people interested in this, all in the humanities, this has really developed enormously in the past 3 decades, and I think it's going to continue to develop. The MLA convention every year, it seems to have more interest. The sessions on cognitive approaches are well attended. It seems to me very promising.
Mm-hmm. And would you say that perhaps the fact that at a certain point, perhaps 30 years ago, that because scientific disciplines like sociobiology and evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology and others that have or apply a biological approach or biological/psychological approach to the human mind, that because they took off by then, that might also have helped with that enterprise of cognitive literature, or not?
Oh yeah, I think two sets of developments in the sciences, one evolutionary, the other neuroscientific, made a big difference. Personally, I think that the developments in cognitive science that partially predated that were equally important, but they don't seem to have caught the imagination of humanists in the way that either the neuroscientific studies, especially when non-invasive brain scanning procedures became more widespread. The earlier cognitive scientific developments just didn't capture the imagination of humanists in the way that either those neuroscientific non-invasive procedures did, or the way the evolutionary psychology and related forms of evolutionary thought did.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. So, Dr. Colm Hogan, just before we go, apart from the website that you've already showed us here, what are some of the other online sources if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
Online sources. Well, as regards my work, I guess the only other one would really be my webpage at the University of Connecticut. So, if one wanted to look it up, one just go to the search for University of Connecticut and go to the English department, and then personnel. But the only website that I have much to do with really is the Literary Universals Project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. And I will be leaving.
And now you're this interview on the Dissenter.
Okay, that's good to know. That's good to know. And I will be leaving links in the description box to the rest of your work, including also your books, which are very interesting. I haven't read them all yet, but the ones I've read, they are all excellent. So, and so, Dr. Colm Hogan, as I said, perhaps in the future we could have another conversation, because there are a lot of topics that I left out of this interview just to try to keep it a bit shorter than we would have needed it to be. But anyway, it was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
It was a pleasure to be on the show, and I'm grateful and honored to be included.
Hi everybody, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end, and also, by the way, for coming to my channel. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep this channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge. Any amount, even if just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons KARIN LIETZCKE and BLANCHETTE per HELGE LARSEN, GUERREIRO, CHANTEL GELINAS, Jim Frank, Francis Ford and FREDRIK SUNDE. Thank you for all.